across America. Live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Because we're going to be talking about the end times, and you might be saying, well, why talk about end times, doomsday subjects? After all, there's a fair amount of confusion, and some people say, I can't make my way through the book of Revelation because it just seems too complex. And again, if you use critical thinking series and maybe do a little bit of logical analysis and look at it historically, I think it makes some sense. But I understand sometimes why people want to avoid that, and we've discussed on this program with a number of different individuals how the whole issue of prophecy is something that many pastors avoid. But there's another good reason why we need to talk about that, because Jesus talked about the end times. And even if you have problems with the book of Daniel or the book of Revelation, you really have to come back to Matthew 24 and 25 and the passages we're going to be looking at today, because it's all part of a new book that came out recently, The End of the World According to Jesus of Nazareth. It is written by our good friend, Jeff Kinley, who is a best-selling author and an individual that's been on this program many times before, author of about 40-plus books. He's served in the past in pastoral ministry, a graduate of University of Arkansas, as well as a THM from Dallas Theological Seminary. He has his own television show, Jeff Kinley Live, as well as the other material that he makes available, for example, as the host and Bible teacher on The King is Coming. We also, in addition to information about this book, published by our good friends at Harvest House, also have a link to the Prophecy Pros podcast. You can find that on the website as well at pointofview.net, as well as a doctoral candidate at Liberty University. So, Jeff, welcome back to Point of View.
Kerby, thanks so much for having me.
One of the things I appreciated is that you dedicated the book to three individuals, Dr. Ed Heinzen, Dr. Mark Hitchcock, and Dr. Tommy Ice. All three have been on the program along with you. And so in some respects, as people will listen to this conversation today and think, well, maybe that's your opinion, you actually are quoting not only from them, but from other people who have been on the program like Dr. Randall Price and others. So it isn't this is like some kind of unique interpretation of Matthew 24. It has been what has kind of been the historical understanding. And I think it also sets aside something I'd love to get your comments about, because we have had other people talk about this, and I don't know that I've ever talked about it with you, but I do notice more and more churches don't talk about prophecy. More and more pastors don't talk about prophecy. And if my estimate is correct, it looks like about 27% of the Bible when written was prophetic in nature at the time when it was written. What are your thoughts?
Well, that's correct. Yeah, there's estimates anywhere from 26 up into the low 30s of percentage of the Bible that was prophetic when it was written. And what's very interesting about that is that you have prophecy in literally almost every book of the New Testament. In fact, God ends his written revelation to us with a book called Revelation that is some 95% prophetic. And so certainly God wants his people to be informed. He wants us to know what's going to happen. It's a heads up on history, really, is what prophecy is. And, those scholars you just mentioned, they're obviously friends of mine, but at the same time, men who I greatly respect and who are greatly respected out in the community of theology and eschatology and pastorate and that type of thing. So, yeah, it's an important subject. And like you said, because Christ himself spoke about it in the last week of his life.
Let's, if we can, just give people an overview. The first part is who is Jesus of Nazareth. We'll just spend a minute on that. But then a whole section on what did Jesus prophesy. And again, for those of you that are looking for alliteration, we're going to talk about destroyed and deceived and despised and declared and desecrated all the way down. Then when will these take place? How should we as believers prepare? How will it all end, and how to escape the coming apocalypse? The way you've written this, obviously, and it's similar to many of your other books, Jeff, is that you could take this book and hand it to someone who is maybe not a believer, maybe at least a seeker, and they start out and say, okay, I'll see. Everybody wants Jesus on their team. Everybody kind of wants to know what Jesus has to say. And so you spend the first part of this section just explaining who Jesus is, and it's a great refresher course for believers, but I think it also is just a great entry point for non-believers, isn't it?
Absolutely. I wrote the book in some ways as an apologetic because, today so many people across the world, secular scientists from global leaders, are talking about extinction events. They're talking about the end of the world. They're talking about the apocalypse. And so here we have Christ's words on here. So I really asked the question, who is this Jesus of Nazareth, and why should we trust his version of end times events? Because in truth, if what he says about the end times, about himself is true, then everything he says is going to be true as well. So it's not just something we should just skip over, but it really does lay a foundation for the book as to why Jesus is qualified to speak on this subject.
Again, those of us that actually have had a course in a Bible college or seminary, oftentimes we refer to Matthew 24 and following as the Olivet Discourse because it's at the Mount of Olives. But one of the things I appreciated about this is you start with Matthew 24 verses 1 and 2 before he gives that message, because it also reminds us that Jerusalem will be destroyed. And I think it also relates, Jeff, to this idea of prophecy. If we can see that prophecies that Jesus gave that have been fulfilled in the past, I think we can have the assurance that prophecies that haven't been fulfilled will be fulfilled in the future. And here you see, certainly, of course, you find more of that in the Gospel of Mark, but you have some individuals who are coming and looking at this incredibly ornate and beautiful temple, and Jesus says, Look at it now, because pretty soon it will not be here. And that is one of those prophecies that Jesus gives even before he gives that discourse. So again, that's an important aspect of how to interpret these prophecies, isn't it?
It is, and it really sets the stage for the rest of Matthew 24, because some 35 or so years, 38 years after this event took place, the temple was destroyed precisely and exactly as Christ prophesied. In fact, if you go to Jerusalem today, you can see on the side of the Temple Mount, many of those stones are still there from the first century in 70 AD. So, yeah, it really does set the stage. It, again, gives Jesus more credibility because what he first said was going to come true actually did come to pass. Now we're looking at these other future prophecies, and we can look at those and say, well, if the first one was literally fulfilled exactly as prophesied, then we have every reason to believe that the other ones will be as well.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we're continuing our conversation today with Jeff Kinley. You might be familiar with some of his other books. We've had him on, for example, to talk about God's Grand Finale. And if you would like to know more about him, first of all, we have a link to his website. Second of all, I would suspect that you should be able to find this book in your local Christian bookstore. So look for it there. But if not, we have a place where you can order it. We also, of course, have information about the Prophecy Pros podcast. I think they're up to, season 13. They've done very well with that. And when we come back, we're going to talk about deception. We're going to talk about wars and rumors of wars. We're going to talk about the whole issue of how the gospel will be declared, but also how there will be false gospels and the need for an understanding of that. And then the question, when will all of this take place? Can we get some ideas about that? At least the general season in which it might take place. And then, of course, by the time we're done, I want to talk about how we as believers can prepare for this. And for those of you that are listening in and say, well, I've never really taken seriously Bible prophecy, what does that mean for me and what can I do? So we'll talk about that with Jeff Kinley. All that coming up right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The International Olympic Committee has ruled that male athletes will not be allowed to compete against women in the Olympics. The ban begins with the 2028 Summer Games in Los Angeles. Now, the announcement came from the IOC president, Kirsty Coventry. She is the first woman and first African Olympic president. She is also the former Olympic swimmer from Zimbabwe, and many of us were introduced to her at the recent Winter Olympic Games. Here are just a few of the key points from her video. She says the policy we have announced is based on science, and it has been led by medical experts with the best interest of athletes at its heart. The scientific evidence is clear. Male chromosomes give performance advantages in sports that rely on strength, power, or endurance. As an Olympic athlete, she also added, at the Olympic Games, even the smallest margins can be the difference between victory and defeat. So it's absolutely clear that it would not be fair for biological males to compete in the female category. In addition, in some sports, it would simply not be safe. Now, you would think that such a policy based on observation and science wouldn't be controversial, but I've read that a former IOC president has been arguing that the traditional chromosomal view of sex is outdated. In fact, he tries to make his case based on his view of science. I applaud the common sense decision by the International Olympic Committee, but I also lament that such policies have come only after hundreds of women have been cheated out of medals that were given to male competitors. The Olympic Committee enacted the right policy, and hope other sports authorities will do the same. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation today with Jeff Kinley as we talk about his book, The End of the World According to Jesus of Nazareth. And isn't it interesting, Jeff, that the first words out of Jesus' mouth as he begins what we call the Olivet Discourse, or this discussion with the Jews, is don't be deceived. And you even refer to that as a deluge of deception. I might even call it a tsunami of deception, because some people say, well, why do you believe we're in the end times? Well, obviously we're closer than ever before, but in some respects you recognize that certainly there were tools for deception in the first century, but the tools for deception in the 21st century are even more significant. And how many times over the last couple of years where I've talked about deception, the need for us to have discernment, the use of all sorts of new media technologies to deceive individuals. And so Jesus, looking ahead to the future, reminds disciples at that time and now us today to not be deceived, because there will be so much that might even deceive us into no longer believing in him or believing in his coming.
Well, it's true, and deception is certainly a huge component of Jesus' end-time scenario. And like you said, it's interesting, that's how he begins to talk about the apocalypse, is that there's going to be a lot of crisis in that day, a lot of chaos, a lot of confusion. Of course, anytime that you talk about the future, people obviously have a lot of unknowns out there. There's a lot of anxiety. And so Jesus said, look, many are going to come in my name. They're going to say, I'm the Christ. I've got the answer for you. And it says they will succeed in misleading many. And, of course, we know from Scripture, Kerby, that one person that's going to really take the bull by the horns, if you will, is going to be the Antichrist. He's going to be the ultimate deceiver. He's going to be empowered and energized by Satan himself, and he's going to tell lies, and just like Satan does. And so that deception is coming, and we're certainly experiencing a lot of that right now in our world.
One of the other signs is wars and rumors of wars, and you remind us that over the 3,400 years that we have of any kind of recorded history, there's only been about 268 years in which you could say the world was at peace. So we've always had wars, but these wars are different because you talk about, for example, nuclear weapons, and I do have a booklet that we've made available to our donors in the past on the whole idea of war, and then we have a more recent one out on nuclear war. And so in some respects, that is another very poignant illustration that, yes, we've had wars, but the possible devastation from war now in the 21st century is something that is completely unprecedented, isn't it?
It is. And in the context of words here, of course, we know from a fulfilled prophecy that Israel has to be a nation for these things to take place. And so obviously a lot of these wars involve Israel, the Middle East, that type of thing. And there's going to be famines and earthquakes. And Jesus said this is just the beginning. And of course, Jesus' narrative here parallels perfectly Revelation chapter 6 and the wars that are going to take place during the first part of the tribulation. So we think we've seen wars now, but the wars that are coming, Kerby, are going to be wars that are going to unsettle the entire planet. So it's going to really bring more and more chaos, which brings Antichrist into a more suitable position to be able to deceive the masses.
One of the other ones, of course, is the idea that believers will be despised. He says they will deliver you up to tribulation, put you to death. Of course, that was a warning for the disciples then, but I think it also looks ahead to another warning of a greater apocalypse that is going to come in the future.
Absolutely. And again, Revelation chapter 6 prophesies that there will be a large number of baby Christians, if you will, during the tribulation that will lose their lives. They'll already be martyred right at the beginning. Of course, many of those, I believe, will be Jews who have come to faith in Messiah. And there's going to be, you think anti-Semitism is bad right now, but Satan's going to launch another Holocaust on the Jewish people and on Christians during that day. So, yeah, there's going to be lots of murder, lots of bloodshed on those who come to Christ during that time.
But the good news is the gospel will be declared, and that is an invitation that the gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. But then you raise a good question, which gospel? Because that gets us into some of the warnings about false gospel, false teaching, the Antichrist, and the rest. And so a lot of what Jesus is talking about in Matthew 24, of course, we see filled out in more detail in the book of Revelation, don't we?
We really do. And what's very interesting about that is that when you look at the whole period of the 7-year tribulation, you've got kingdoms of the world, plural, becoming one kingdom under Antichrist. And in the book of Revelation, God proclaims that that kingdom is going to fall and another kingdom is coming into place. So part of the gospel message throughout the tribulation is, look, this kingdom of Antichrist is a false kingdom. It's the Titanic. It's going to hit that iceberg, but another kingdom is going to come, as prophesied by Daniel, by Jesus, by Revelation, that is going to supplant Antichrist's kingdom. It's going to be a kingdom that will never end.
Again, you have chapters on the temple will be desecrated, and of course, Antichrist will display miracles. But talk about that first issue first, the idea of the temple, because a lot of people say, well, you know, you've been predicting the end of the world, you've been predicting that Christ will come again. But I think one of those issues is, would the Jews be in the land, 1948, is it possible a temple could be built because there's no temple there right now? So what can we think about, and how can we maybe put some of that together in terms of when the temple would exist, when it would be built, and then, of course, whether the Antichrist would then eventually there would be a desecration of that and display miracles. Can you kind of play that out for us for a few minutes?
Yeah, it's a bold prophecy that Christ makes here, because in verse 2, he says the temple is going to be destroyed. And then over here in verse 15, he says, in the future, in the far future, in the last days, there'll be another temple. Because you can't desecrate a temple that doesn't exist. And 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 tells us that Antichrist at the midpoint of the tribulation will enter the Jewish temple, proclaim himself to be God, and essentially desecrate that temple. I say, well, what evidence is there now that that temple could be built? Well, you've got the Temple Institute, founded in 1987, whose express purpose is to rebuild the Jewish temple on the Temple Mount at the point where they believe the original temple stood there. They've already fashioned priestly garments. They've done sacrifices. They've drawn up blueprints. They trained over 500 priests. They're just waiting for that real estate to become available to them to do that. So Christ he's going out on a limb, if you will. He's saying, look, there's going to be another temple, and here we are in our day. We're seeing these Orthodox Jews pushing hard for that temple to be built.
What I think is so helpful is you're taking us through the chapter 24 of Matthew, and then you're giving us, of course, cross-references, as you did just a minute ago, to the writing that Paul did to 2 Thessalonians 2 and other passages. And so for a person that sometimes is struggling with how to put that all together, if you even just use the timeline in Matthew 24, you obviously get a more expanded timeline in a little bit in Daniel, but mostly in the book of Revelation. And it seems to me that it's a good way to begin to develop that. And early on, I think you even talk about the fact that one of the things we seem to be missing today is just any of our critical theories, our critical ability to critical thinking skills, logic, and the rest. Really what you're doing is providing us a timeline, providing us an outline, and then if you just use a little bit of critical thinking and do a couple of cross-references, you really end up with this whole idea of end-time scenario, don't you?
You do, and God is obviously the master storyteller, and Jesus puts it all in chronological order for us, and it's great because it's like a movie today, Kerby, where you'll have a scene, all of a sudden it'll switch to another scene that actually helps inform the scene you've just watched. And that's exactly what cross-referencing does in the Scripture, back to Daniel, over to Revelation, over to 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. It all fits into this beautiful puzzle that God has created and given us this end times narrative. But as you say, it does require a little digging, a little bit of cross-referencing, and that's why we call it Bible study instead of just Bible reading.
When we come back from the break, we're going to talk about, of course, then the Son of Man will descend from heaven. But you're probably thinking, okay, I really appreciate the way in which Jeff has put this together. But then the question arises, when will these things take place? And Jesus doesn't leave us open to trying to figure that out either, because he helps us understand some aspects of the Jewish people, some aspects of the fact that this will be sort of like the days of Noah, and a number of other factors that will help us understand that. And so then we'll move from there to even then, okay, how should we prepare? And for those of you that maybe have never experienced a Christian conviction, maybe never trusted in Jesus Christ, what does that mean for you, and what can you do to avoid what I think is unfolding before our very eyes? But again, there is, I think, a real need for us to look at some of these end-time scenarios, and this book I think you will find very helpful because it looks at the end of the world according to Jesus of Nazareth. It's written by Jeff Kinley. We have a link to his website and his podcast. You can go to our website, pointofview.net, and find it, and we will continue our discussion right after this.
It almost seems like we live in a different world from many people in positions of authority. They say men can be women and women men. People are prosecuted differently or not at all, depending on their politics. Criminals are more valued and rewarded than law-abiding citizens. It's so overwhelming, so demoralizing. You feel like giving up, but we can't. We shouldn't. We must not. As Winston Churchill said to Britain in the darkest days of World War II, never give in, never give in, never, 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 never yield to force, never yield to the apparently overwhelming might of the enemy. And that's what we say to you today. This is not a time to give in, but to step up and join Point of View in providing clarity in the chaos. We can't do it alone, but together, with God's help, we will overcome the darkness. Invest in biblical clarity today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue conversation today with Jeff Kinley as we talk about his book, The End of the World, According to Jesus of Nazareth. We've been talking primarily about the second part of his book, What Did Jesus Prophesy? Going to finish off by talking about the idea of the Son of Man will descend from heaven, and then move into this idea, this very important question that we all have at one time or another wondered about. Does Jesus give us any indication of when this would take place? And then we can obviously move into some other parts of that chapter 24 and then into chapter 25 in how we can prepare. But the first issue is that we have this whole section in which it talks about the coming of the Son of Man. And I would say, Jeff, anybody that has perhaps watched The Chosen recently, you can see that there's a couple times when if Jesus refers to himself as the Son of Man, which to us seems kind of generic. That is, as they might say in the South, fighting words. And that's what also gets him in such trouble, because that is an allusion back to the Son of God or the Son of Man. And it's a direct claim to deity, but it also is the description of what it will be like when Jesus returns. Can you help us out with that?
Absolutely. In fact, the Son of Man was Christ's favorite name he gave himself, and uses some 81 times in the Gospels. And so, yeah, it refers back to the one that is described as deity in the Old Testament, the one that's going to sit on David's throne. It's the one that the Jews would have recognized as his claim to deity. That would have been his best claim to deity, if we're using that phrase. What's very interesting is that the disciples had asked Jesus, Lord, when will these things take place? And throughout the entire apocalyptic discourse here, he doesn't really tell them what the sign's going to be until we get to verse 29 and 30. Then he says, then the sign of the Son of Man will appear. And that scene there, Kerby, in verses 29 through 31, is perhaps the most dramatic description of the second coming anywhere in the Bible, with perhaps the exception of Revelation 19. But it's a contrast between darkness and light, between evil and glory. And when that sign happens, Jesus says, that's when you'll know the end of the age has come.
Well, and again, you talk about the fact he comes as the conquering Christ. Recently, we had Max Lucado, because he's written about this as well, and he says, a lot of people tend to think of Jesus as the baby in the manger, or Jesus as the one who is saying, go the extra mile. But this is not an individual that comes to take sides. This is a person who comes to take over. And so that really is, I think, a very dramatic scene. And in some respects, you go with a long list of the fact that when you talk about his kingdom, he was originally at the creation. He was certainly foretold in the Old Testament, prophesied to David, proclaimed to Mary, on and on and on. You go through this very long reminder of who he is. But since that is one of the signs, it brings us to another couple of signs, and that is everything from the Jewish people to the fig tree to a variety of others, and even the idea that no one knows the day or hour. So here we have a whole series of statements that Jesus gives to us so that we know when to be looking for him. But the first of those, which you talk about in chapter 12, is that the Jewish people are preserved. You try to find today Hittites, Canaanites, Jebusites, even Babylonians. I mean, it's really kind of hard to find those. You go to Israel, you find Jewish people. You go around the world, you find Jewish people. And in some respects, that is a remarkable fulfillment of prophecy as well, is it not?
It is. It's one of the most prophesied predictions in the entire Old Testament. In fact, it's the most often prophesied prediction that we have there. And what's interesting is that for 2,000 years, the Jewish people were scattered to really across the whole world and lost their language, their religion, suffered everything. But there's never been a people group, Kerby, in the history of civilization who's ever been scattered like that, but then drawn back to themselves, to the point where today almost half of all Jews in the whole world are now back in Israel, exactly as God said. God preserved them. And the reason why is because he's going to bring Israel to salvation at the end of that 7-year tribulation period. And what I find really interesting, too, on this whole thing is that just the context of Jesus' words, he's speaking about the future. He's speaking about the end times. He's speaking about the tribulation, specifically from a Jewish standpoint, because he's speaking to his future Jewish brethren. And this is what you need to do to get prepared for my second coming, which, by the way, does have a lot of signs leading up to it.
And again, you also, of course, have links to the two witnesses, the 144,000, the rest, which are not there. But again, if you do the cross references, you can find that as well. And if you want to know a little bit more about just the remarkable idea of the regathering of Jewish individuals to Israel, I think you'll find that chapter very helpful. But let's again keep moving. And one of those is that then we have him say that concerning that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven nor the Son. But he does give us another possible sign. And that is, just as it was in the days of Noah, the idea of eating and drinking and marrying and giving in marriage, you have this idea that once again, this would be a time in which there would be an unexpected return. So again, you have a whole section there that, first of all, needs to remind us of what it was like in the days of Noah, and then why Jesus uses that as such an example to be using as an understanding of when indeed his return is imminent.
Yeah, when you go back to Genesis chapter 6, we look at the days of Noah, we survey that generation, and they were filled, the Bible says, with violence. It says that there was rampant immorality all over the planet. They had no thought about God. They were just doing their own thing, living their lives, eating and drinking, as Jesus said, giving in marriage, and there's many different interpretations about that, but suffice it to say is nobody cared about God. They were all living for themselves, pursuing their own pleasures, and that's why the flood took them by surprise, and they were taken away in judgment. So, too, the second coming will take away those in judgment as well when he returns.
And again, as you point out, it is so unexpected. So the idea is, therefore, you must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming an hour you do not expect. And so it could happen today. It could happen before the end of this broadcast. But I wanted to also then move into the section that you have on how should last days believers prepare. Because, again, for individuals listening to this that might like to take your book and turn it into a sermon, you have be on the alert, be a faithful steward, be awake, be wise, and those are some very good be comments. But the first of those is to be alert. It does seem to me that we can kind of be lulled into complacency and recognizing that Jesus gives, if you will, one of the briefest of all parables to illustrate his point, and that has to do with the idea that the Lord would come like a thief in the night. But it's a reminder that it could happen at any moment, isn't it?
Well, it is, and particularly in this context here at the end of the tribulation period, you think, well, gosh, don't people know Jesus is coming back at that time? But Christ says, no, they're not going to be ready for it. They're not going to be anticipating the ultimate judgment of God, even though he's already given the seal, the trumpet, and the bowl judgments. People are going to be deceived, as we talked about in the beginning of the program. They're also going to suffer a delusion by God himself. They're going to be blaspheming God by this time in the tribulation. And that's why Jesus says to his Jewish brethren, look, your contemporaries here today, they missed me. Don't be like them in the end times. Make sure that the Jewish people will recognize that Messiah is coming, so be on the alert.
One of the other B's is be a faithful steward. That's as he is kind of winding down chapter 24. But this is a golden opportunity, but also a situation in which some will fail the test, and hopefully others will be strong to the finish. Can you help us out with that?
Yeah, I mean, the whole idea of being a faithful steward is just realizing everything we have really is a gift from God. Our time, our life here on this earth, our possessions, our personalities, our skill sets, our spiritual giftedness, it's all a stewardship. And basically, God says, I want you to max out. I want you to be the best that you can be for me. Yes, be alert, but also use what's been given to you so that you can return that back to God and say, look, I invested, I did a good job with what you gave me, and that way we can be a faithful steward.
Jeff Kinley with us. We're going to take another break. The book is entitled The End of the World According to Jesus of Nazareth. We've already talked about be on the alert and be faithful. When we come back, we're going to talk about being awake and being wise. And then we're going to say, okay, how does this all end? Because we have a judgment coming, and certainly how can we escape the coming apocalypse? Those are the last two sections of the book, and these are good resources for not only you as a believer to begin to understand that. This is written in such a way that you could give to a non-believer and have him or her kind of read through that and come to the obvious conclusion that they indeed need to escape by trusting in Jesus. So we're going to talk more about some of the other actions that we all should be involved with, and we'll talk about that with Jeff Kinley right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Again, privileged to have with us a little bit longer Jeff Kinley as we talk about his book, The End of the World According to Jesus. Again, published by Harvest House. Should be able to find it in your local bookstore. We have a link to his website as well as to the podcast, which we'll talk about before the end, because I would encourage you to go and find some of those resources. But we've been, of course, talking about the fact that, of course, we have the prophecies of Jesus. And Jeff, of course, we talked about be on the alert, be a faithful steward. Two other ways to prepare: be alert and then be wise, because it does seem to me that what Jesus is reminding us of is there is going to be deception, and a wise and discerning believer needs to pay attention to what is happening around the world and evaluate that in light of Scripture.
Well, and to stay awake, as the parable, as he said in Matthew 25, the first parable, the 10 virgins, is the same thing he told the church at Sardis: wake up. Because I think a lot of times, Kerby, we can sort of be lulled to sleep by culture, even by the church and what's going on, and we sort of get complacent. And Jesus says, no, I want you to have your lamps ready, to be ready, because the bridegroom's going to come at a time you think not. So always be prepared. And 1 John 3:1-3 says that whoever has this hope of Christ's return in them purifies himself just as he is pure. So there's great motivation, just like a bride getting ready for the wedding day.
And again, the idea of being wise as well, because again, we are living in a time in which we sometimes don't even know what to believe or who to believe. We need to find trustworthy sources, and that is certainly one of those other very important issues. But I think before we're through, you do have a section on how will it all end, and that, of course, moves us into the next chapter, Matthew 25. Of course, we're already there anyway, in terms of what he talks about the fact that there is a kingdom that is coming, but also there is a valley of decision. And I think it's going to be really important for people to understand that although people want to talk about Jesus in terms of someone who talks about considering the lilies of the field and turn the other cheek and love your enemy, Jesus also talked more about hell and judgment than he did about heaven. And that's a part of Jesus that sometimes people ignore willingly because they don't realize there's a coming judgment.
Well, that's true. The Jesus of Revelation chapter 1, his vision to John, the Jesus of Revelation 19, which he parallels here in Matthew, coming at his second coming, is a Christ of judgment. He's riding a war horse. He's coming to make war and to obliterate his enemies. And there's going to be a judgment for those who are left over at the end of that second coming. And he basically separates them into two categories. These Gentiles, those who showed kindness towards the Jewish people and those Jewish believers as evidence of their salvation, and those who were a part of putting them into prison and turning them in and arresting them and treating them cruelly. And Christ says, those of you who treated my brothers well, he says, enter into this kingdom now that I prepare for you. And the others, he says, you'll go away to eternal punishment.
So again, one of the reasons why I know that you like to speak on prophecy, and by the way, in just a minute, I want to encourage people to go to your website, which we have a link to on the website, and maybe even invite you to come and speak or hold a prophecy conference at their own event that they might have, is that prophecy is certainly important to prepare believers for the future, but I can't think of a better way to get people to understand that there is a coming judgment, there is a coming apocalypse, and Jesus offers the way out, which you talk about in, of course, your book, but also Jesus talks about in Matthew chapter 26.
Well, he does. He begins talking about his own crucifixion. We have Mary, the woman who comes to anoint his feet with perfume, and she's preparing him for his burial. So essentially, he's preaching the gospel to them, saying, gentlemen, this is the real reason why I came here, was to die for sins. And this is really kind of the so what of all of this, of everything Jesus talks about in the apocalypse, is what are you going to do with this Jesus who claimed to be God, who claimed to know the future, and who claimed to die on the cross for your sins and rise again? Every person must face this Christ and make that decision.
And again, you have a whole section on the fact that Jesus rescues his bride from the coming wrath. I have also noticed, interestingly enough, Jeff, that more and more churches not only aren't speaking about prophecy, they aren't talking about the rapture, or they're saying, well, that's maybe a misunderstanding of 1 Thessalonians 4 or other passages, or even 2 Thessalonians 2, whatever it might be. And so, again, that's why you put that in the book, because that is also the great hope for the believer living now.
Exactly. It's called the blessed hope, and Christ told his disciples in John 14 that he would return and take them to heaven, not into the kingdom, but up to heaven. And so for us as believers right now, we look at the history of what God did in the Scripture, and Kerby, his pattern is always to rescue the righteous before divine judgment comes. He did it for Noah. He did it for Lot. And he's going to do it again, I believe, for the church prior to this horrific time of God's judgment on the planet.
Let me just mention now for the next few minutes the fact that you have a website, jeffkinley.com. You don't have to even remember that because it's on our website there. And also, I might just mention that we also have another section in which we have a link to your podcast, which you've been doing now for more than a decade, and it's going strong, and an opportunity for people to ask questions. But if people go to jeffkinley.com, they're going to, of course, be able to tune in to some of the material you have. They can find the various speaking events, and I've been looking at your schedule, and of course, where we broadcast. As a matter of fact, in the future, you're going to be even up in Canada, but we broadcast in California and Georgia and all the places where you are actually being booked and interviewed and all the rest, and places where you're going to be doing conferences. So first of all, if somebody would like to meet you face to face, they need to first of all go there and check out the schedule, because it's quite possible that just down the road they could have a chance to hear you speak, or sometimes you're a part of a panel with a number of prophecy experts, but also you would be available to come and speak in their church or do a prophecy conference in that community. So talk about some of the resources that are available on your website.
Yeah, you can find out more about my books, my ministries, my 2 podcasts, the 2 TV shows, as you said, my itinerary. And there's also some materials there that'll help you in your Christian life just to grow. You can download the Vintage Truth app, and there's tons of resources we give out every week.
And again, the podcast has been going strong for a long period of time, and I've always appreciated the fact that when we first started talking with you and Todd, we've oftentimes mentioned the podcast. It's called the Prophecy Pros Podcast. Of course, you have a link on your website, but we created a separate one there so that people can listen to it on Apple or Spotify, a variety of other resources. And you take on all sorts of different questions. A lot of them, of course, have to do with eschatology, but some of them have to do with other theological issues. After all, you're theologically trained. You've been a pastor, and you can certainly address those as well. So you can find those at prophecyprospodcast.com. But again, don't have to remember all the details. We have all the links there as well. And so, Jeff, I certainly have appreciated the work that you've done over the years. We appreciated the interview on God's grand finale. This book, I think, is also very helpful to people. The End of the World According to Jesus of Nazareth. And it's always been great to have you on the program, and I look forward to the next opportunity.
Same here, Kerby. Thank you so much. God bless.
Let me just one more time mention that the book is published by Harvest House, about 250 pages. It has a number of sections, 20 different chapters on who is Jesus of Nazareth, what did Jesus prophesy, when will these things take place, how should last days believers prepare? How will it all end? And, of course, a very important kind of gospel message at the end, how to escape the coming apocalypse. We are in the end times, no doubt, and certainly we need to know more about that. And certainly one way to research that and understand that is to go back to Matthew 24 and 25 and 26 and see what Jesus had to say about that. And you've been listening to Point of View.
In 19th century London, 2 towering historical figures did battle, not with guns and bombs, but words and ideas. London was home to Karl Marx, the father of communism, and legendary Baptist preacher Charles Spurgeon. London was in many ways the center of the world, economically, militarily, and intellectually. Mark sought to destroy religion, the family, and everything the Bible supports. Spurgeon stood against him, warning of socialism's dangers. Spurgeon understood Christianity is not just religious truth, it is truth for all of life. Where do you find men with that kind of wisdom to stand against darkness today? Get the light you need on today's most pressing issues delivered to your inbox when you sign up for the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Every weekday, in less than 2 minutes, you'll learn how to be a person of light to stand against darkness in our time. It's free, so visit pointofview.net/signup right now. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this. Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
If you listen to Point of View any length of time, you know that we oftentimes have talked about the problem with housing, and it surfaces in a number of different ways. First of all, you have the issue of homelessness, and that brought about sometimes by the emptying of some of those who are mentally ill or dealing with very significant issues, and as a result are not able to actually be housed other than maybe in a rescue mission. We've talked about on the other extreme, the fact that there are individuals that would like to have a house, but because the increase in the cost of housing, because this has been an appreciating asset, and the increase in interest rates have actually put a situation where less than half of the country could realistically afford a house. We've also talked about sometimes how some of these environmental pieces of legislation, like the Endangered Species Act or the Clean Water Act, have been used to erase and even destroy the idea of private property rights. And then we, of course, talked about how sometimes government housing, so-called Section 8 housing and others, are inadequate, and we haven't necessarily done all we can to improve the lives of individuals. And if any of that sounds familiar, the way in which we oftentimes talk about this is sort of in bits and pieces. But I have in front of me here a book that covers that and much more in about 350 pages. It is really one of the most extensive looks at the crisis of housing in America, and the title of the book is Nowhere to Live: The Hidden Story of America's Housing Crisis. It is written by James Burling, who started out really as a geologist, got his master's degree in geology from Brown University, decided to go back and get a law degree from the University of Arizona College of Law, had his law degree, and now has been working with the Pacific Legal Foundation really since 1983, and of course has worked very much in this area of everything from environmental law and property rights to eminent domain. So James, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
It's good to be with you.
Let's, if we can, kind of give people an overview, because you first of all spend some time talking about zoning and then just the whole destruction of working class, the issue of eminent domain. Remember when we talked about the Kelo decision here on Point of View, environmental laws used to essentially destroy property rights, the whole issue of rent control, and then all the other issues that have led to the, if you will, homelessness crisis. And at the end, then you give us a way out. And it does seem to me that this is perhaps a very extensive look at this level of the housing crisis. And as I've said before, you can't solve this problem by simply saying, I know, let's just give $25,000 to first-time home buyers, or let's just simply implement more rent control, or let's just build more government housing. The problem is much deeper than that, isn't it?
The problem is much deeper than that. And the problem is not that government hasn't tried, but unfortunately, government has caused a lot of the problems we're in today from one failed policy after another. And the bottom line is that there has been a significant erosion of property rights over the last century, making it much, much more difficult, if not impossible in some areas, for people to build homes that people want to live in where they want to live. So we have a whole series of government problems that have just come together one after another, building on top of each other, limiting the supply of housing, where demand has remained the same or demand is going up. When you have a disparity between supply and demand, what happens? Prices go up. And that's what we've been experiencing. Prices go up and up and up to the point that housing is now, as you said at the outset, unaffordable for a substantial number of American citizens.
Let's, if we can, work our way through the book, because there are 8 sections and 26 chapters, and we'll certainly be skimming over the surface. But I was thrilled that you actually started by talking about zoning, because we oftentimes talk about zoning in a positive way, but you remind us that there is a racist history to residential zoning, and that oftentimes what happened is zoning was used to really keep people of color out of certain communities, and that's part of the history that I really appreciate you included, because it's something that we don't talk about very often.
Absolutely. I begin my book, Nowhere to Live, with a story of George McMetchen. He was a very successful Yale-educated attorney in Baltimore, Maryland, and he and his schoolteacher wife decided to buy a nice home, a very nice home in a nice neighborhood in Utah Place, Baltimore. And he bought the home, but within several days, local youth had taken rocks and broken pretty much every window in his home. Why? Because the neighborhood was all white and George McMetchen and his family were all black. After that, Baltimore passed the nation's first zoning law, which made it illegal for a black person to buy a house and move into a white neighborhood, under penalty of, in 2024 dollars, about $3,000 in fines and up to a year in jail. Now, that ordinance was wildly popular in the southern states and the border states between the North and the South, and it was passed in many places. Ultimately, an ordinance like that landed in Louisville, Kentucky, and the Supreme Court got a hold of it, and the Supreme Court declared it to be unconstitutional because it was a deprivation of the rights and property. But that wasn't, unfortunately, the end of exclusionary zoning. Following the racial zoning, which was struck down, we saw economic zoning, where large areas of cities and in the country were zoned off limits to multifamily housing, to affordable housing. Only large lot homes were allowed, homes on large lots, and that made it unaffordable to working class people. It made it unaffordable to immigrants. And the Supreme Court upheld that under the justification that apartments where immigrants live are like nuisances, and they destroy otherwise nice neighborhoods. And that's the legacy that we have with zoning. So we think today zoning sounds nice, it preserves neighborhood character and keeps things, industry out of residential areas. But unfortunately, zoning, by limiting ability to build in so many communities to large single-family homes on large lots, it basically excludes a substantial portion of Americans from housing. Those people that would otherwise live in apartments or duplexes or triplexes, the sort of homes that are illegal in large parts of America.
Again, the book is entitled Nowhere to Live, a hidden story of America's housing crisis. We're going to take a break and come back and get into some other aspects of this. I think it would be eye-opening, but also if you find yourself struggling with the issue of housing in your community, this might be a book that you would want to read. It might be a book you want to pass on to somebody that's part of a zoning board, somebody that is part of a city council, and we certainly just briefly mentioned this whole idea of the racist history of residential zoning. We could really spend an entire hour on that, but I want to move on to the issue of eminent domain, which is a big issue, and it's an issue that James Burling and other lawyers have been dealing with. It's, of course, a case that went to the Supreme Court, but the impact that that has on the working class housing. Then we're going to get into how some of these environmental laws are destroying property rights. We have a lot to cover. We'll do that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The International Olympic Committee has ruled that male athletes will not be allowed to compete against women in the Olympics. The ban begins with the 2028 Summer Games in Los Angeles. Now, the announcement came from the IOC president, Kirsty Coventry. She is the first woman and first African Olympic president. She is also the former Olympic swimmer from Zimbabwe, and many of us were introduced to her at the recent Winter Olympic Games. Here are just a few of the key points from her video. She says the policy we have announced is based on science, and it has been led by medical experts with the best interest of athletes at its heart. The scientific evidence is clear. Male chromosomes give performance advantages in sports that rely on strength, power, or endurance. As an Olympic athlete, she also added, at the Olympic Games, even the smallest margins can be the difference between victory and defeat. So it's absolutely clear that it would not be fair for biological males to compete in the female category. In addition, in some sports, it would simply not be safe. Now, you would think that such a policy based on observation and science wouldn't be controversial, but I've read that a former IOC president has been arguing that the traditional chromosomal view of sex is outdated. In fact, he tries to make his case based on his view of science. I applaud the common sense decision by the International Olympic Committee, but I also lament that such policies have come only after hundreds of women have been cheated out of medals that were given to male competitors. The Olympic Committee enacted the right policy, and hope other sports authorities will do the same. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue conversation today with James Burling as we talk about Nowhere to Live, the hidden story of America's housing crisis. I thought we'd get into this issue of eminent domain, and that is the idea that obviously sometimes we need to have the government take over some land to create a road or whatever it might be, but they are to give just compensation. But you also point out that now the rise and the overuse of eminent domain has had an impact on housing, and you tell the story of Chavez Ravine, which today, of course, is where Dodger Stadium is, but perhaps the most famous one comes not from California, but comes from Connecticut, New London, Connecticut, and Suzette Kelo and the famous, or should I say infamous, Supreme Court decision on Kelo. Explain that if you might. Eminent domain sometimes is necessary, but it has been overused and I think abused, and that's affected housing as well, hasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Eminent domain is supposed to be the sort of the power of last resort if government needs to do a project, such as a road or build a military base or a school. But what's happened is that the constitutional requirement that eminent domain require the taking of property for public use has been changed by the Supreme Court from public to anything in the public interest. And what is in the public interest is whatever is in the eyes of the political powers that be in a state or in a local city or county. And so we have example after example where entire neighborhoods have been destroyed in order to make way for some economic project. In my book, I start with Chavez Ravine, where in 1959, Aurora Vargas, who was a World War II widow, was literally carried out of her home by sheriff's deputies from L.A. As soon as she was taken out and the rest of her family was escorted out of her home, the bulldozers were literally right there next to her property. They were turned on, fired up, and they knocked down her property. She lived in a very vibrant Mexican-American community in Los Angeles. Originally, the plan was to tear down the homes and build some kind of housing project, but that housing project never materialized. Instead, the project was being used for Dodger Stadium. Now, Dodger Stadium was one of the more successful, so to speak, uses of eminent domain because the Dodgers remained some years a good ball team. But, that aside, we have example after example. Detroit, there's a neighborhood called Poletown, a working-class neighborhood, mixed ethnicity. It was destroyed to make way for a General Motors plant. A couple decades later, General Motors abandoned the plant. The houses are gone, the neighborhood's gone, and the industry's gone. You saw the same thing in the Kelo case that you mentioned in Connecticut.
Right.
A neighborhood was destroyed to make way for Pfizer Pharmaceutical. Pfizer left after a dozen or so years. So we have had a tremendous amount of urban, ethnic neighborhoods, working-class neighborhoods being destroyed for redevelopment projects that have done virtually nothing for the communities that were destroyed, and oftentimes nothing economically either.
Well, again, that whole section is helpful, and maybe some people are familiar with the case with Pfizer in New London, but you give many others. But I thought we'd keep moving because another section you have is using environmental laws to destroy property rights and even housing operations. And you have, for example, the Endangered Species Act. And, of course, we broadcast all over the country, but our people in Tennessee probably remember the snail darter case, although I suspect anybody might remember that one or many others, the spotted owl situation in the Pacific Northwest for our listeners up there in California and Oregon or places like that, or a variety of others. And then, of course, you have the Clean Water Act, which we talked about the other day with one of our guests. All you have to do is have a pond actually continue for a longer period of time, and all of a sudden the EPA will say, well, that's navigable water, and thus we can really shut down your private property rights. So what have you found in this area? Because I know you've done some litigation in that area as well.
Absolutely. I mean, you mentioned the Clean Water Act. We represented a couple that were trying to build a modest 3-bedroom, 2-bath home in Priest Lake, Idaho. They were told to stop by the EPA because there were so-called wetlands on the property. It took nearly 2 decades to go through the litigation process. We took 2 trips to the Supreme Court at Pacific Legal Foundation with a couple, Mike and Chantel Sackett, trying to build this home. Eventually, we won both cases at the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court said, no, this wetland is not subject to federal jurisdiction. That freed up millions of acres that could otherwise not have been built upon. But we have so many rules and regulations like this that take vast amounts of acreage off the property. And each little endangered species habitat combined with a little bit of wetland here and a little bit of wetland there, these combine to make hundreds of millions of acres off limits or incredibly difficult to build upon in this country. And we're not able to build the homes that people need to live in because of these environmental regulations and restrictions. I am all for protecting the environment, but I'm also for putting the people in that environment as well and balancing the needs of people with the needs of nature. We can have both, but right now we're not doing that.
Well, and again, one other example that I might use for especially our California listeners in the Central Valley was the Delta smelt, another fish. And it almost seemed like for a while that individuals, especially with the EPA or with the Department of Agriculture, whatever it might be, might find one particular unusual fish, fowl, in some cases even insect, and that was enough to then just close down the need for a home. And I'm all, as you are, for environmental protection, and there have certainly been some great success stories of various species that look like they might go extinct that have been brought back from the brink because of that. But when sometimes it does appear that you're picking one particular species or one particular element in the environment to then close down the possibility of development that would be beneficial to so many Americans, I think that's when people begin to react and say we've gone too far. What are your thoughts?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's just you can take any piece of land in this country and find some unique environmental aspect of that land, and then decide, well, there's got to be something, a unique species on that land, and we have to shut down the development. And even if you don't find it, you can at least allege that in the lawsuit. And one of the problems that I talk about in Nowhere to Live is the litigation abuse, where people claim that there is an environmental issue with a particular piece of property, but they're doing it just to keep the development away. The not in my backyard types and others that really care much more about their own, what they have, or the environment than they do about the people that are not able to find a house to live. And I think it's great to protect things, but we have to keep things in mind. We have to understand that people need a place to live, and it's becoming so difficult for young people, for working class people to find homes. Well, the problem is that we just aren't allowing the homes to be built because of endangered species, because of wetlands, because of open space views, because of agricultural preserves, because of all kinds of rules and regulations that have great idea in theory, but they've been abused by people over and over again.
Well, let's, if we can, take a break. Let me just mention that, first of all, we have a link to pacificlegal.org. And if you'd like to know a little bit more about the work that they are doing, certainly you can scroll through and find out some of the stories dealing with such things as property rights, equality and opportunity, separation of powers, and some of the Supreme Court cases they've been involved with. And, of course, if you'd like to know more about this book, it's been out for about 2 weeks, and we have information about it on the website. You can click on the button there, and it's a way in which you can get it either in hardback or Kindle. And so when we come back, I want to get into some other aspects of this as well. One of those is rent control isn't the answer. And then the whole issue of, okay, let's see if we can come up with some kind of affordable housing, and how effective has that been? I think you're going to find out that it's been unworkable, unaffordable, unproductive, and, of course, unconstitutional. But other than that, it's been great. I think you can see where we're going with that one. And then also, what about this issue while we're talking about the homelessness, and the fact that there has been an emptying sometimes of some of the individuals that have mental health issues, and it's one of the reasons they don't have a home, because they actually do need care that they're not receiving, because under the auspices of providing them with some freedom, we're putting people out on the streets that are dangerous either to themselves or to others. And then we'll talk about, okay, what can we do? Are there answers? I think there are. And so if you think that this issue of the homeless crisis is intractable and cannot be solved, that's not the case. But I think we need to understand all the different factors that have given us what today is America's housing crisis. So we'll continue our conversation with James Burling right after these important messages.
Who can you trust? Years ago, many of us could probably have provided a fairly long list, but today it seems we almost can't trust anyone. Educators don't even know what a woman is anymore. Many so-called public servants have shown all they care about is themselves. The FBI has been accused of bias, law-breaking, betrayal, and journalism. It's largely corrupt, with no Clark Kent standing up for truth, justice, and the American way. All of this is why Point of View Radio is more important than ever, and your part in supporting us is more needed than ever. Do your part today in supporting trustworthy truth. Stand with us and help push back the lies and the darkness. Visit pointofview.net. Don't put it off. Take a moment right now and click on that big blue button that says Donate Now, or call to invest at 1-800-347-5151, pointofview.net, and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again as we talk with James Burling about his book, Nowhere to Live, The Hidden Story of America's Housing Crisis. Really kind of doing a little more of a deep dive into this issue. And I recognize even though we're trying to give you a lot of content, there is 26 chapters and 8 different sections. So obviously we're still skimming over some of it. But we've talked about zoning. We've talked about eminent domain. We've talked about how sometimes environmental rules are destroying our concept of private property rights. But I thought James would get to another one because people say, well, we need to have affordable housing. So 2 particular sections, one on the issue of rent control. Here's a simple answer that doesn't work. That is, well, if the rents are too high, we'll just tell people they can't raise the rents. So what's wrong with that? I think it gets back to one of my commentaries on supply and demand, but also gets down to the idea that, well, if prices are too high, we'll have price control. We know that does not work, but yet you give us a little bit of the history of rent control and explain to us why this simply does not work. Can you help us out?
Absolutely. Rent control does not and cannot work because what it does is creates a terrible disincentive for people to add to the housing supply. So rent control feels really nice if you don't think about it very much. Oh, it's keeping rents low. But it doesn't really work that way. Rent control, by limiting the incentive to build new housing, creates a shortage. Supply goes down. Demand remains the same or continues to go up. Prices increase. So while people living in rent-controlled apartments may benefit themselves individually, overall, the community experiences higher housing prices. Every economist that has looked at rent control to any degree, left and right, will tell you rent control doesn't really work to keep housing prices down. Indeed, there is an economist who, a number of years ago, said that rent control is the most effective way, other than bombing in a war, to destroy a city. Yeah. If rent control is serious enough, landlords will have to abandon their properties. They cannot make money on properties. Right now, New York City has a new rent control law that just supplemented the old one, and it prevents landlords from recouping any investments for repair. If you have to put in $50,000 for a new heating system, you can't recoup that investment, and it goes on and on and on. I talk about in my book the example of St. Paul, Minnesota, that adopted a few years ago rent control of 3% per year, regardless of inflation. There were housing projects in the works. Sticks and bricks were coming out of the ground, and when that rent control ordinance was passed, the equipment was pulled off, the workers were pulled off, the project was stopped. Why? Because rent control. And nobody wants to build housing where you're not going to be able to recoup the investment. And city after city where rent control has been tried, it hasn't worked. We did a study, and this follows other economic studies, comparing rent-controlled cities with adjacent non-rent controlled cities. Rent control is supposed to help the poor, the elderly, working class people, but what we found in our study that in every instance, the people living in rent-controlled units in the rent-controlled cities were whiter, were richer, were better educated, were more within the demographic of being young and working than in the non-rent controlled cities. Why? Because people with greater stability in their lives, i.e. those richer and whiter and longer-term jobs, are able to stay in one place longer to take advantage of rent control. Rent control has been a disaster where it's been tried, and it's going to continue to be a disaster wherever it's tried in the future, including those proposals to make it nationwide.
I might just mention, too, that you have a number of pictures, and I've often said a picture is worth 1,000 words, especially when these are such horrible pictures. You got a picture of a partially demolished tower in Cabrini Green, that's up there in Chicago. You show, of course, what the land that was supposed to be used by Pfizer there in New London, Connecticut, but the one that goes with your one on rent control, you just a minute ago said it sort of looks like something that had been bombed, and here is a picture that you have from the South Bronx where there's rent control. And the picture literally looks like a picture that you see from a war-torn region of the world. So again, sometimes even as you give us facts, figures, pictures, and the rest, those pictures sometimes illustrate this is what it looks like when you follow this way. What about the other issue, though? Because some people say, okay, maybe affordable housing through rent control doesn't work, but how about affordable housing mandates? That is, again, something that you've dealt with in the courts, and it is, again, an attempt to, in some respects, use, if you will, almost extortion to bring about some kind of solution that actually is unworkable and, as you point out, unconstitutional.
Yeah, the idea behind affordable housing mandates is that you take a developer, somebody who's building maybe 10 units or 20 units of an apartment building or homes in a subdivision, and some communities now require that developer to set aside 10, 15, 20% of the units, oftentimes equal in quality within the development, and set that aside for affordable or subsidized low-income housing. Or the developer can pay a sum of money to do the same thing. But who's going to pay for that? Does it come out of the developer's pocket? Well, indirectly, but at most definitely it comes out of the pockets of the people that want to buy this new housing. So overall, the price of housing goes up. The economists that have been studying this have found it really doesn't seem to help the affordability issue. It just redistributes money from the new home buyer to somebody who is not able to afford a new home. Now, I have all the sympathy in the world for somebody who cannot afford to buy a new home, but the solution is to simply allow more home building and not to make the housing that we are building more expensive for everybody else. And that's what these mandates do. And also, the idea that to get a permit from the government to build houses, you have to give up this low-income housing, it is unconstitutional because there is no legitimate reason for doing this. If you want to subsidize housing in a community, then I suppose you could raise taxes on the entire community instead of having it a tax only on the people buying new homes who don't yet live in the community and therefore don't vote in the community yet. So it's a really, in a way, a crass political stunt to say you're doing something about affordable housing, but really making the cost even higher.
One of your shorter chapters, and it's one I'll just mention before we go to a break, is this whole idea of whether we should be emptying the mentally ill into our streets, because that gets us into a conversation we've had on other programs about homelessness. A lot of that is well documented in a book by Michael Schellenberger, San Francisco, Why Progressives Ruin Cities. But that's another issue, and although this is just a small part of the housing crisis, it's also part of this issue of homelessness, isn't it?
Yes. When I was an undergraduate, I did volunteer work in a large upstate New York mental institution. In 1976, the patients told me one after another, Jim, I'm going to a halfway house. Jim, I'm going to a halfway house in Schenectady, Albany, wherever. And I'd ask each one of them, well, how long are you going to be there? And they would tell me 6 months, 6 months, 6 months. And then I would ask, what happens after that? They had no idea. Nobody did. And we know now that those people that after they were let out of the halfway homes with the idea they would continue to take medications and would be okay, ended up on the streets, ended up in our jails. And society has done a tremendous disservice to our mentally ill population by simply sending them out onto the streets in order to, and the conservatives wanted to save money, liberals thought it would enhance their dignity, but it has really destroyed their lives, and it's really a dereliction of our duty as people to take care of those people who cannot truly take care of themselves. And I think the mentally ill are front and center of another failed government policy in our housing issues, in our housing crisis.
And again, we'll probably talk about that in more detail later. It's one of the shorter chapters, but we'll take a break when we come back. Okay, you've been hearing some of the problems. What are some of the solutions? And I think you can already think of one, and that is the need for us to come back to some basic private property rights. And so I'm certainly going to ask James to talk a little bit about the rise and fall, and maybe again the rise once again of this idea of private property. The whole whole issue of eminent domain or takings, what that might mean, and really what is the future of housing in this 21st century world? What can we and should we be doing if indeed we want to provide affordable housing for individuals? It isn't just a simple answer. As you can tell, it's a complex set of reasons why we have the crisis, and obviously there are other kinds of solutions and different kinds of solutions necessary, but it's all part of this book, about 350 pages, great material on really the housing crisis and a way in which you can understand this issue in a little bit more depth. 8 sections, 26 chapters, and we'll continue our conversation with James Burling on Nowhere to Live right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. James Burling with us as we talk about his book, Nowhere to Live. If you've been listening, you recognize that one of the biggest issues is this whole area of private property. So, James, let's, if we can, maybe come back and you, of course, give a short history of the rise and fall and hopefully the rise again of private property. But having the right private property rights does solve some of the problems that you address in the book, doesn't it?
I think it would. I mean, back a century ago, if you owned land, you had the right to use that. That was your property right. You could use it to farm. You could use it to cut trees. You could use it to build homes if that's what you wanted to do. But today, those property rights have been severely diminished because you simply can't go out today and build a home or homes that you would like to put on the market for people to live in. The neighbors have to be part of it. The NIMBYs, the not in my backyard people, want to come in and prevent you from building those homes. Or the local community and its environmental regulations. That is, they are your partners in home building, if you will, or the decision. So the decision is no longer that individual. It's no longer your individual to decide how you're going to use your property. And that diminishment in property rights has really caused to a loss of a lot of the housing that we have today. So what I propose is that we restore these property rights. Let people do what with their property, whatever is reasonable, and not allow so many hands to be put into the, to stir the pot to make it almost impossible to build new homes. We are getting some of that back. Some of the courts are beginning to recognize that if government regulates your property too much, that is a taking, and you should be compensated for it. But the even better solution would be for government to get out of the way and allow home building to occur so people can build homes near where people want to live.
One of the things I appreciate is that you also talk about how some of that is rooted in kind of political philosophy, which is kind of one of my background areas, and that if you think about John Locke and the Second Treatise of Government, the concept there is that government is not creating property, but government was formed to protect it. In other words, the earth is the Lord's, the fullness thereof, if we want to use a Bible verse. And so in some respects, when we talk about rights, government does not grant rights. Those rights are inherent because we are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, although some said life, liberty, and property. And it does seem to me that if we come back to some of these sort of biblical principles and some of these historic principles that come from the Enlightenment, that would help us begin to understand a little bit more about property. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. Our founding fathers were heavily influenced by John Locke. And if you read the Declaration of Independence and you read John Locke's Second Treatise, you will see that lines are basically taken out of John Locke's Second Treatise, written about a century earlier, and put into our Declaration of Independence. The bottom line is our founders recognized that people do have inherent and alienable rights. And it is the role of government to protect those rights, not to destroy them. And the Declaration of Independence continued that when government is the engine of destruction of those rights rather than protecting them, then that government is illegitimate and it should be replaced. So I think these first principles are extraordinarily important to recognize the rights of people in their property that should be protected. That's not to say that we do not have other duties, of course. And one that I like to point to is, as Jesus said in Matthew, quoting Ezekiel, we have to love thy neighbor. And thy neighbor is just not the person who lives next to us today that looks just like us, but our neighbor is everybody in the community, people who would like to live in our community who cannot now afford to. And we need to make it more easy for people to live in the homes in our communities that they can afford. And we're not doing that now, but I think that we can move in that direction later. As we move forward, if we recognize a problem, we can begin to cure it.
One other aspect of that is that you point out that some of these regulations need to be reformed. And so, who you elect as president, who they put on the Environmental Protection Agency, who might be in the Department of Agriculture, who is going to maybe be elected to the United States Senate and be questioning whether or not we need to rethink the environmental issues like the Endangered Species Act are important. But also, you've pointed out at the beginning the issue of zoning, and zoning, even paying attention to who is going to be on your zoning board, and some of that are also very important issues. But just before we end, let me first of all mention that you can perhaps find this book in your local bookstore, but if not, we have information about it on the website so that you can get it both in hardback and Kindle. But we also, I might just mention, James, have a link to the Pacific Legal Foundation. So if somebody would want to contact you, maybe have you speak on this issue, maybe consult with you because of an issue they're dealing with in their community, is it possible for them to contact you?
Yes, go onto our website, pacificlegal.org, and there is a link there for submitting a case if you think we have a case to look at, or how to get a hold of us. So there are all kinds of links on pacificlegal.org, and I recommend people go onto that website and see what the sort of things Pacific Legal Foundation does. See more information about my book, Nowhere to Live, The Hidden Story of America's Housing Crisis. We also have a website for that, nowheretolive.org. So there are lots of ways of finding out about what we do and how we try to protect property rights throughout the country.
Again, that is pacificlegal.org. We have that link on our website, so you don't even have to remember it. You can grab that a little bit later by going to our website at pointofview.net. But James, thank you for writing the book. Thank you for giving us an hour today, and thank you for maybe clearing up some of the issues that we have discussed from time to time, but I don't know anywhere where all of those issues are found in one book except in your book. So I appreciate you writing it and joining us today here on Point of View.
It's been a pleasure talking to you today.
Let me just mention again that when we get into this issue of housing, whether it's homelessness, whether it's the need for affordable housing, whatever that might be, these are really important issues. And I think it's illustrated by the fact that I failed to mention that the foreword is written by U.S. Senator Mike Lee. And it isn't just one of those sort of obligatory forewords. It goes on for a couple of pages because he recognizes that this is an issue as well. And I think what is so helpful about this book is not only the facts and figures, but the number of pictures that are there, because it shows you what happens when a particular zoning issue is changed, or what happens when eminent domain takes place, or what happens when rent control is implemented, and you can see visually the impact that some of this is having. So this is why I thought this would be a very helpful book for you to consider. Of course, you can find it in your local bookstore. You can, of course, go to Pacific Legal and find out a little bit more. But as I mentioned, 26 different chapters, 8 sections, and we've covered everything from the issue of zoning and eminent domain and property rights that are oftentimes destroyed by, I think, an overzealous interpretation of some of these environmental laws, the whole issue of rent control and what that can mean, and the fact that sometimes in an effort to have affordable housing, the mandates cause more harm than good. And of course, even a section we talked about in terms of the homelessness because of so many people mentally ill being put out on the streets. And then finally, 2 chapters which go into some detail about how to fix the hidden story of the American housing crisis, all part of this book, Nowhere to Live. And again, we would encourage you to find out more on our website at pointofview.net. Click on the button so that you can find out more about pacificlegal.org and the book Nowhere to Live. And you've been listening to Point of View.
I'm sure that you've noticed that social media is now filled with information generated by AI. Dramatic descriptions of politicians and music stars supposedly making statements about a current issue, leaning into the microphone, looking into the lens, opponents silenced. It's powerful, it's riveting, and it's all lies. Even several national television networks were recently found using enhanced pictures, meaning manipulated, falsified, literally not giving a true picture. So many liars, so much deception. Where can we turn for truth? Right here. From Kerby and the team at Point of View, we need your support. Please join the Point of View Truth Team today with a monthly gift of $30 or more. Together, we can shine the light of truth and dispel the darkness and deception of this day. Give now at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151, pointofview.net, and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.